Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to install front upper control arm offset bushings on a Honda S2000. Generally speaking, installing offset control arm bushings is an easy way to get additional front camber and fender clearance when you're running wide front wheels. The bushings work by pulling the front upper control arms towards the frame of the car. On my Club Racer, these bushings increase my maximum negative camber from negative 2.5 to negative 3.7 degrees. Anyway, let's get to it. The first thing you want to do is jack up the car, get the front of the car on jack stands, and remove the front wheels. Now use a 10mm socket or wrench to remove the 3 bolts securing the wheel speed wiring harness to the upper control arm and the wheel knuckle. Once the wire is free, push it away or use something like a zip tie to attach it to the tie rod. In order to give yourself some more room to work with, you should lock the steering wheel in the opposite direction of the wheel you're working on. So if you're working on the left control arm, turn your steering wheel to the right and vice versa. The next thing you'll want to do is pop the upper ball joint out of the wheel knuckle. The first thing I recommend doing is unloading the upper control arm bushings. Use a 17mm shallow socket and a breaker bar or ratchet to loosen the 2 bolts securing the upper control arm to the frame of the car. You'll just need to loosen the bolts a turn or two before you'll see the bushings become unloaded. With the bushings unloaded, use a set of pliers to remove the cotter pin from the upper ball joint. Then use a 17mm shallow socket to remove the castle nut securing the ball joint to the wheel knuckle. Before using the ball joint separator, I recommend threading a hex nut onto the ball joint threads. This will serve 2 purposes. First, it'll prevent the upper control arm from violently flying out of the wheel knuckle, and second, it will prevent the threads on the ball joint from being mangled by the ball joint popping tool. I recommend using a standard hex nut since the castle nut is much more fragile. Finally, use the ball joint separator to pop the ball joint out of the wheel knuckle. Once popped, remove the hex nut threaded onto the ball joint. Now that the ball joint is loose, use a 17mm shallow socket and a ratchet to remove the 2 bolts securing the upper control arm to the frame of the car. Pull the bolts out of the upper control arm and remove the upper control arm from the car. If you'd like, you can use something like a zip tie to attach the wheel knuckle to the strut. With the upper control arm removed, it's time to remove the old rubber bushings from the control arms. For this part of the job, I'm using a 20-ton press from Harbor Freight, but you may be able to use a bench vise if yours is large enough. In order to remove the upper control arm bushings, I keep it simple and use a combination of sockets. I use a 24mm deep socket to press the bushing out of the inside of the control arm, and then I use a 1 3/4 inch socket to support the outside of the control arm. When you're pressing out the OEM bushing, be careful that the ball joint does not bind against the press at all. With the old bushings removed, it's time to install the offset bushings. The first thing I'd recommend doing is lubricating all of the bushings and the metal sleeves with some grease. The offset bushings come in 2 variations, thick and thin versions. Select a thick bushing and place it on the outside of the control arm. As you can see, the hole in the bushing is not centered, it is offset. In order to install these bushings correctly, you'll want to position the hole so that it is closest to the direction of the ball joint on the control arm. Once you're satisfied with the placement of the bushing, you can begin pressing it in. For this part of the job, I use the same 1 3/4 inch socket face down and use it to support the inside of the control arm. I then place the 24mm deep socket on top of the bushing and press the bushing into the control arm. Once the outside bushing is pressed in, take a metal sleeve and push it through the hole of the bushing. Then simply take a thin bushing and place it on the inside of the control arm so that the hole of the bushing is aligned with the metal sleeve. Use the same 1 3/4 inch socket to support the inside of the control arm and use a 24mm deep socket or another socket on top of the bushing to press the bushing into the control arm. Once the bushing is pressed in, wipe away any excess grease. At this point, the control arms are ready to go back into the car. Before installing the upper control arms, apply a light layer of grease to the outsides of the bushings near the metal sleeve. This should allow the control arm to pivot freely and prevent any squeaking noises after installation. The only other thing you'll need to pay special attention to is the installation of the washers on the inside and outside of the bushings. This can be a bit annoying, but feed the bolts through the bushings and carefully push the washers in between the frame and the bushing. You should be able to use the bolts to catch the washers. Unlike installing rubber bushings, the offset bushings don't need to be torqued down with the suspension under load. So use a 17mm shallow socket and a ratchet to tighten the bolts securing the control arms to the frame. Torque them down to 75.9 foot-pounds. Once torqued down, ensure that you can move the control arm up and down with some force. Otherwise, you'll need to add some grease for lubrication. Insert the ball joint into the wheel knuckle and use a 17mm socket to tighten the castle nut securing the ball joint to the wheel knuckle. The torque spec for the castle nut is between 36 to 43 foot-pounds for AP1s and 41 to 48 foot-pounds for AP2s. The reason the torque spec is a range as opposed to a specific number is because the holes on the castle nut will need to align with the holes on the ball joint stud in order for you to insert a cotter pin between the two. So start torquing the castle nut at the lowest number in the range and keep tightening it until you can fit a cotter pin through. Once you can fit a cotter pin through, install a cotter pin. Next, use a 10mm socket or wrench to reinstall the 3 bolts securing the wheel speed wiring harness to the upper control arm and the wheel knuckle. Torque these bolts to 8.7 foot-pounds. Reinstall the wheels and lower the car back down to the ground. The last thing you'll need to do is get an alignment on the car because your alignment will have changed pretty dramatically. Otherwise, you should be good. If you found this video helpful, give this video a thumbs up. Otherwise, leave a comment down below for any DIY you'd like to see in the future.